So we're looking here at the Heart Sutra. And the Heart Sutra contains, again, the word heart means essence, the essence of the Perfection of Wisdom sutras. Perfection of Wisdom was this wisdom of emptiness. So this Heart Sutra contains the essence of the teachings on emptiness. And we're just starting to have a look at Avalokiteshvara's response to Shariputra in terms of how to practice this wisdom of emptiness in the various stages along the Mahayana path to enlightenment. And what we saw was that in the initial stages of the path, emptiness is something that we need to come to realize through using reasoning and logic, inference, to, as we saw here, to subsequently see in a correct way that everything's empty of independent existence. And so we're now going to have a look at this famous statement here in the Heart Sutra: form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form, form is also not other than emptiness. So let's have a look at what these statements mean. So we see the first statement, form is empty. So remember, form here is one of the five aggregates. The five aggregates is the presentation of the basis of the person. So the form aggregate here is really talking about the body. So effectively what the statement is saying is the body is empty. But when we see statements like the body is empty, we have to say empty of what? And here, emptiness doesn't mean nothing really exists. This is not saying the body is empty, therefore it doesn't really exist. What it's saying is the form is empty, or the body is empty of inherent nature, or in other words, empty of independent existence. So this statement that things are empty of independent existence, or another way of saying independent existence is empty of inherent nature, inherent existence, this is emptiness. So emptiness is not saying nothing really exists. Emptiness is saying things are not independently existent. So this is the ultimate nature of form, or the body. In fact, as we see in the Heart Sutra, emptiness is the ultimate nature of everything. Everything, nothing exists independently. Everything's empty of independent existence. And as we saw, initially, to come to realize this, we come at it by using reasoning and logic. And that's a little bit the approach we used in that meditation we just did. In that meditation, of course, we weren't looking for the body, we were looking at the me that was here meditating. And so one type of reasoning, and there are different types of reasoning we can use. The one we used in that meditation was basically the reasoning of what's called same or different. Because if something exists independently, it must be findable. We must be able to point and say, there it is. So in terms of here, in terms of the person, the reasoning we can use is this: if there is an independent me here, that independent me has got to be found as either being the same as the body and the mind, or different than the body and the mind. And if we can't find it in one of those two places, the independent findable me does not exist. So that's what we did. This approach is what we did in the meditation. First, we were looking, is the me that seems to be here, is it the same as the body and the mind? Can you find the me in the body? Can you find the me in the mind? If we can't find the me in the body and the mind, then it must be different than the body and the mind. And there, you must be able to take away the body and the mind and be left with the me. And if you can't, then it's not findable. That's the reasoning. And therefore, if you can't find that me as either being the same or different than the body and the mind, that not finding the me is an experience of emptiness. So we just hold that experience of not finding. So here, it's often said that not finding is the best finding. And so that's what emptiness in the meditation, the experience of emptiness is this experience of not finding, having searched thoroughly. So that's the approach we used. So therefore, whether you're looking for the body, the person, the mind, then if we use this sort of reasoning, we can come to that experience of not finding that independent me, and that experience of not finding is an experience of emptiness. So that is how we can come to an experience of emptiness initially at our stage, and here on the first stage of the first two stages of the spiritual path, of the Mahayana path. But often when we look at this statement, form is empty, then people often feel, oh, form is empty, it doesn't really exist. So often what happens is we fall to the extreme of nihilism, misinterpreting what this statement means. To help avoid falling to the extreme of nihilism, misinterpreting that, oh, it's empty, it doesn't really exist, we have the second statement, which is emptiness is form. So what this is saying, emptiness is form, is what it's really saying is that because things are empty of independent existence, therefore form, the body and the person and so forth, can appear and functions. So what this is saying is that because of emptiness, we can have form, the body, the person and so forth. So this is talking about the subtle conventional nature of everything. In this case, of course, we're talking about the body. So emptiness is form, or emptiness is the body, is saying because the body is empty of independent existence, the body can appear, it can function. So what it's really saying here is that the form or the body is a dependent phenomena. So this is talking about the conventional nature of everything, that in fact everything is a dependent arising. So this, and as we're going to see in the next two statements a little bit later, emptiness is not other than form, form is also not other than emptiness, meaning that emptiness and the fact that things are dependent are like two sides of a coin. And so often the reasoning there that we see is that in general things are empty is that things are empty of independent existence. So again, this is emptiness. Why? Because they are dependently existent. And the technical word for that is dependent arisings. So often the statement we see tying these two ideas together is that things are empty of independent existence. They're not independently existent because they are dependently existent. So this is the word dependent arising. Arising here means coming into existence. So things come into existence dependently. So therefore, if we can understand how things are dependently existent, we'll understand why they're empty of independent existence. So that's going to help us better understand emptiness. So that's what we're going to look at now, is how are things dependently existent? In other words, because emptiness is form, how is form or anything dependent arising? So that's what we're going to look at now. And by understanding this, that'll help us better understand emptiness. So the first way in which things are dependent is they depend on causes and conditions. For example, to have this laptop here existing, we need lots of causes and conditions. One of the first conditions we needed, of course, is someone needed to design this laptop. Then, of course, we needed all the raw materials to be collected, refined. We needed all the various components to be manufactured, and then we needed all of that stuff to be assembled. So, and then, of course, we needed all the people and factories involved in all that as well. So without all of those causes and conditions, we wouldn't have this laptop here now. So I think that's fairly easy to understand, that things depend on causes and conditions. This is something very well understood in science, of course. But also, of course, things depend on their parts. Again, this laptop, you know, without the casing, without the buttons, all the electronic components, the screen, without all of these parts here, we wouldn't have a laptop. So again, I think that's fairly straightforward, is that things depend on their parts to exist. So I think all of us here can quite happily accept these two ideas. True? Straightforward. But remember, what we're saying is that because things are dependently arising, that is a reason that would make that things are empty of independent existence. But I think we can all happily accept that this laptop exists depending on causes and conditions of parts, but probably most of us are also happy to accept that when we walk in the door here, there's already a laptop sitting here on the table. True or not? But this reasoning should be overturning that idea. That reasoning should be stopping us from understanding or believing that there is a laptop already existing here on the table when we walk in the door. But it doesn't seem to have that effect, I think. Why? Because we don't really understand these ideas at a very deep level. We only understand them very superficially. So to understand these at a deeper level, we have to go to the third way in which things are dependent. That things exist depending on imputation, labeling, conception. So these are all three different words for the same thing. So if you understand one of these words, you understand them all. So what does it mean for things to exist depending on imputation, labeling, or conception? So again, we look at that and we might think, oh, I think I know what that means. It means there's a thing here that we're calling a laptop. Again, that's fairly superficial understanding of what this really means. To really understand what that means is we can understand that when we look out on the world, what's appearing to us, of course, is just a mass of sense data, particularly visual data. And of course, we have to make sense or meaning out of all of this data, otherwise we couldn't function. So what do? Is we create objects. We draw lines around various collections of data and create an object. So we divide up the world into many objects because we have to do that to make sense of this. But we do more than that because we need to communicate, so we have to give names to these things that we've created so that we can communicate. So this third point is that whole process whereby we draw lines, create objects, and then give a name on top of that. The way in which we divide up the world is not fixed. It's completely arbitrary, depending on the meaning that we want to get from the world. For example, how many things are there? How many things are there? Don't we decide? Is there one thing there from its own side, a star? existing independent of our conception? Is there one thing there when we come along? Or do we create perhaps one thing by drawing a line around there and saying, oh, there's one star there? Or we may do a different way of drawing lines and we go, oh, actually there's 2 triangles there. Or we may do another way, we may say, oh, actually there's 6 triangles there. Or another way, there's 6 triangles and a hexagon. Or there's a collection of 18 lines there. So how many objects are there? Is there 1, 2, 6, 7, or 18? How many objects are there? We decide. We create the objects. There's not an object there existing independently of our conceptual framework. We create the objects. We need to do that, of course, because we have to make sense or meaning. We couldn't function. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. We have to do that. The problem is we don't realize we're doing that. The problem is we believe there's already a fixed world of many discrete objects already there before we come along. That's the problem. That's where we're out of sync with reality. So therefore, what we're saying is here is you'll often hear this term that things are merely labeled. Meaning that things do not exist more than within our conceptual framework. There's nothing existing beyond our conceptual framework. That things are merely just only labeled, only existing within our conceptual framework. So this is what the third point means, which means another way of saying this is that things are not findable. You cannot find a star here in the basis. There's no star to be found in the basis in that data. We create the star. So often another way that you'll see the term is things are not findable, meaning there's no star to be found here within the basis from its own side. Okay, based on this understanding, let's now have a look at how we can understand these 2 ideas at a deeper level. So this is a timeline. This is the seed, and this is the plant that it produces. So we saw back there that the plant exists depending on causes and conditions. The underlying cause for the plant, of course, is the seed, and the conditions necessary to have the plant, of course, is the soil, sunlight, water, and so forth. So without the seed and all of those conditions, we wouldn't have the plant. So the plant exists depending on the causes and conditions. Now, we believe that things like seed and plant exist independently, independent of our conceptual framework. If that's the case, at what point does the seed become the plant? If seeds and plants exist from their own side, it should be a fixed, obvious point where the seed becomes the plant. So where does the seed become the plant in this timeline? Who can tell me? Where does the seed become the plant?
When you decide to make it a plant.
Exactly. So the seed becomes a plant when, only when, this configuration of data stops looking like our concept of seed and starts looking like our concept of plant. And each one of us have slightly different concepts of what a seed and a plant is. Therefore, for some of us, maybe that's where the seed becomes the plant. For some of us, it could be here. Some of us could be here. We determine when the plant comes into existence. There's no plant existing from its own side. Another point that can be very helpful with this is we say that the seed and plant are in a cause and effect relationship. And by definition, if two things are in a cause and effect relationship, they cannot exist at the same time, by definition. So here's the question. Does the seed cease existing before the plant comes into existence? So again, you've got to think about it clearly. Does the seed stop existing before the plant comes into existence? There can only be two answers, yes or no. Which is it? No. If you say no, it means that seed exists at the same time as the plant. By definition, that is illogical. So no is illogical. You cannot use no as an answer. It's illogical if two things in a cause-effect relationship. If you say yes, the seed has ceased to exist, where's the plant coming from? The seed ceased to exist, where's the plant coming from? So what we can understand from this logic is that cause and effect, if we believe that things exist independently, a thing like cause and effect becomes completely illogical. It cannot work. It cannot work. And actually, the great Indian master Nagarjuna, who really expanded on this perfection of wisdom teachings, he wrote a classic text in Sanskrit called Mula Madhyamika Karika, the fundamental wisdom of the middle way. And in his classic text, he uses 27 chapters of arguments like this. You believe in independent existence? What about seed and plant, cause and result, agent and action, fire and fuel? How do these things work? And then it just becomes illogical. All these common sense ideas we have, if we believe in independent existence, become completely illogical. They cannot work. So this is another way of breaking down this false view that things exist independently. Another part of the question here.
Yeah. I think you could argue that this is just to do with our like the mental events of how we conceptualize the world, and has nothing to do with the nature of the world, so that it doesn't really matter which words we use to describe.
But the only world we can talk about is the world we experience, correct?
Yeah.
And the world we experience is a world that we create, isn't it?
Well, we create it from some basis, right? Like we conceptualize it, right?
Correct.
But
correct.
From this, there's some basis.
There's a basis, but isn't okay? But isn't basis a concept that we've developed? Isn't atom a concept that we've developed to try and understand things? Isn't it? Is there an atom existing independent of our conceptual framework?
I wouldn't go as far.
Huh?
I wouldn't say so.
No. Well, that's what we're saying. So the tricky point here, and that's what we're going to see a lot next week, is that for us now, there's just two possibilities. There's two options. And we're stuck in what's called the two extremes. The first extreme is called the extreme of existence, meaning independent existence. So that's where we're stuck now. We believe this. And for us now, there's only two possibilities. Either there is this independent world or there's no world, because we cannot see any other possibility, because the only world that we've identified with is this. So this idea of emptiness is undermining this. Through using reasoning and logic, we can come to correctly establish there is no independent world. It just does not exist. It's illogical, in fact. But then when people do this, they then wrongly assume that not finding this, they flip to the other extreme. And the other extreme, of course, is the extreme of non-existence or nihilism, is that by correctly using reasoning and logic, correctly understanding this just can't exist, we flip to the other extreme because we think there's only two possibilities. Either there is this independent world or there's no world. So then we often flip to this extreme. And this is what the Heart Sutra and what Nagarjuna was all about. Madhyamika means middle way. we're trying to find the middle way. The middle way between these two extremes. And that's what this statement is talking about. Particularly, emptiness is not other than form, form is also not other than emptiness. Because emptiness helps us to overcome this extreme. Emptiness helps us to understand that things are not independent. And dependent arising helps us to overcome nihilism. Things do exist, they're dependently existent, they're merely labeled, helps us to overcome nihilism. And so understanding that emptiness and dependent arising, you know, emptiness is not other than form, form is also not, it's like two sides of a coin. So by understanding those statements, it really does help us to find that middle way between those two extremes. And that is the real challenge here, is to really find that middle way. Because as you said, you know, for us now, we demand there must be a basis there for something to exist. There has to be a basis there for something to exist, because we can't entertain the possibility of anything existing without an independent basis. But that's only because we're stuck in these two extremes. So that's what we're trying to overcome.
It seems that when I've been listening to you talk and talk and talk and talk, and it seems to me one of the problems with this is actually we're caught up in words. And even when we're thoughts, it's words. So we've got these definitions, thoughts, and they seem to have dependent, they seem to, if there was no explanation about words, then we're left basically with what actually happens, yeah? That we didn't have to, the problem is communicating this, which is not communicating. Well, in my head, listening to my thoughts that are going around, I'm not communicating to you, so I'm just listening. I'm actually already limiting what I'm experiencing, because I'm already thinking about it, which is thoughts and basically everything else. If I could get rid of these conceptual ideas, which are based on thought, then what happens?
Then you couldn't function. See,
because I would still be here.
But you couldn't function because nothing would have meaning.
Everything would have meaning, because everything is then possible.
See, we have to be very careful here in that, and this is what's called the pre-trans fallacy in philosophy, is that people want to go back before conception. But what we need to do is go forward, use conception to go forward, not to regress back. So what we need to do, the problem is not conception. The problem is we don't understand conception. Because what we're saying here is that emptiness is not other than form, or form is not other than emptiness. What we're saying is that dependency, things that merely labeled, is the meaning of emptiness. It's not like they're in contradiction and we have to get rid of. So it's not like there's emptiness and then there's conception, and conception's a problem. We get rid of that, we get to emptiness. We're stuck in the duality. What we need to understand is there are two sides of the coin.
But I think
it's just a word. That's conception, and emptiness is just a word.
Yeah, but the thing is, what we have to understand is that not understanding conception is the problem. Not understanding what that really means. That's the problem.
But it's an intellectual understanding.
Correct.
You want to understand everything in words.
Correct. Therefore, so what we need to do to go forward with conception is you need to come to realize emptiness directly.
Yeah.
Then directly you'll understand conception, not the way we do now. So you're right in that you're never going to be able to figure out this conceptually. But the solution is not to abandon conception. The solution is to use conception to go beyond. Because if you don't have a framework, then what are you going to do? It's not like blanking your mind is not going to be the solution. Blanking your mind of conceptual thought is not going to get you anywhere except in a stupor.
So it's a kind of
In a stupor?
awakening.
Drunken state.
Kind of awakening.
Drunken state.
Not in a stupor.
Stupor.
In a stupor, okay.
Stupor. So you have to use words to go beyond it. It's like the analogy often is sticks. Rubbing two sticks together, you burn them. So what we're doing here is using conceptual framework to understand where to go. But then you have to go beyond that. You can't, it's like the analogy is that, you know, in the Buddhism, you got the boat to cross the river, but once you cross the river, you leave the boat behind.
Yeah.
So you use conception to go beyond conception. If you abandon it from the beginning, you've got no tool to help you to start to go beyond. You'll just get stuck in a blank state. So this is the trick, is to know how to use it to go beyond.
Because it's something we have
Forgotten.
Yeah,
Well, yeah.
What do you mean when you use the words realizing directly?
That's going to be next week. So what we're looking at now is the first two stages of the path accumulation, preparation, but also for us as a beginner. So as a beginner, we approach emptiness through using reasoning and logic, using conceptual framework, inference, to come to conceptually realize emptiness as a starting point. But then we have to go deeper. And so this is going to, I think, be the answer to the question as well, is that you use that as the starting point to go beyond, to end up to come to directly realizing emptiness. And that's what's going to happen at the next stage of the path of seeing, which is the topic for next week. So that's what I'm saying, is here you need to use reasoning and logic and conception as the vehicle to start this, because otherwise, see the problem is as well, is you don't have that. You may sit down and you may have some sort of non-conceptual state, but how do you interpret that? Because not every non-conceptual state is a realization of emptiness. In fact, it could be just spacing out. You know, you can space out well in a non-conceptual state. You can stop conception, but that's not understanding anything. Stopping conception. What we need to do is to realize emptiness. And to realize emptiness, we need to have a framework for practice. And that, of course, is a conceptual framework. And so that's where we start, with that conceptual framework, so that we know where we're headed. And then we know if we have some experience, we can correctly interpret that, whether it's a valid experience or whether we're just spacing out and not really going anywhere. Because that's the thing, is that many people, you know, believe that, oh, the goal is beyond conception. So that at the start, they just blank their minds and they sit in a blank state. And often they think, oh, I'm realizing emptiness, you know. And then they just delude themselves because they're just in this spaced out state. And this is one of the dangers too, is that, you know, what we're talking about here is the wisdom practice, or in other words, vipassana practice. As a basis for that, we have what's called the shamatha practice. Shamatha practice is just to develop a stable, clear mind. In that practice, the conceptual mind goes completely quiet. And then when that happens, people who don't have this conceptual framework, they have this non-conceptual state, and then they delude themselves thinking, oh, I've realized nature of reality because I had a non-conceptual mind. And then they don't go anywhere except get very delusional, believing that they've achieved enlightenment now, and sort of not really gone anywhere. They have not gone 1 millimeter on the Mahayana path, in fact. To go there, you need vipassana practice. And so this is the starting point of that. It's very important. Otherwise, we can have all sorts of strange ideas. But yes, I mean, we need to go beyond conception, of course, and that's the third stage we're coming up to, is that now, see, even at these two stages of the path, if we sit down and do this meditation, and we have this experience of not finding the me or whatever we're searching for, then there's still a sense of me, the meditator, realizing or having this experience of not finding. So that's still a conceptual experience, but it's a valid experience. It's a valid experience, but still conceptual, because there's still a sense of me, the meditator, realizing this thing emptiness. But then we have to go one step further and go deeper to a point where it becomes completely non-conceptual, that experience. But that's next week's topic. Okay. just a couple more things before we wrap up today. So this is in terms of causes and conditions, understanding. The other one is in terms of parts. We say, for example, this pen exists depending on its parts. And it's not findable. There's no pen to be found here in the basis. And we can sort of highlight that. We can see that quite easily, because if we search for the pen here, is there a pen to be found in the basis? Is this a pen? No. Is this a pen? No. Is this tube a pen? No. Is this plastic tube a pen? No. Is the ink a pen? No. Is the metal ball on the end a pen? No. Where's the pen? And then people go, oh, that's easy. It's the collection of that stuff is the pen. So here's the collection. Is that a pen? Oh, no, no, no. It has to be in a certain shape. Okay, you have to tell me when the pen comes into existence. No? No? Anyone?
No.
Oh, what about that?
Not necessary.
Not
useful.
necessary. Before it was necessary, but not now.
No, it's about the use.
Exactly. So we bring the pen into existence when this configuration of data closely enough resembles our concept of pen, and our concepts generally have at least two parts, appearance and functionality. So when this collection appears closely enough to our concept of pen, and it seems to function according to our concept of pen, then there's a pen, not before. Because if a pen exists from its own side, if there's a pen to be found here, it would mean that everyone who looked here would see pen. But I think if a caveman walked in here, they wouldn't see pen. They'd probably see some sort of weapon for stabbing. And then, of course, if a dog came in here, they'd probably see some sort of chewing stick. And if a tiny ant came here, they may see some home to live in. So is this a pen, a weapon, a chewing stick, or a home? From its own side, none of those. From the side of the observer, all of those things. So we bring the pen into existence. So there's a big difference, but see, this is the problem, is that we have a label and we have the basis. What we do is we fuse the two together. Don't we say this is a pen? Technically, that's very misleading, isn't it? Shouldn't we be saying pen is something I'm labeling on this basis? Aren't we applying the label pen to this basis? When we point and say this is a pen, we're saying the label is the basis. That's a big problem. The label is not the basis. Because another problem with this is the basis is something that's always changing, yeah? The label pen, does that change? But if you stick it to the object, then you get some solid, unchanging thing, pen. So even our language gets us into trouble. The way we speak gets us into trouble. So what we need to understand is that the pen is not the collection of the parts. There's no pen to be found here. Pen is merely labeled depending on the collection of parts. So if you can understand those two statements are not saying the same thing, you're beginning to understand something about emptiness. So the two statements is the pen is the collection of the parts versus pen is merely labeled depending on the collection of the parts. Big difference. Likewise, this is not person. The person is not the body and the mind. Person is something merely labeled depending on the body and the mind. Big difference. Big difference. But what do we grasp onto? The person is the body and the mind. This is me. This is the person. That's the problem. And one last point, and then we'll finish this evening, is To also help us understand this idea of emptiness dependent arising, often there are many analogies given in Buddhism when this is presented. One analogy that I like and I think can be very helpful is the analogy of a dream. Now, of course, when we're dreaming, in the dream, there appears to be a dream me here, and there appears to be an independent dream world out there. And in the dream, if we encounter something pleasant or unpleasant in the dream, often we have a lot of craving and attachment for the pleasant things, a lot of aversion, fear, and anxiety for the unpleasant things. But if in the middle of the dream, suddenly we realize, oh, this is a dream, i.e. lucid dreaming, then there still will appear to be an independent me here, and there still will appear to be an independent dream world out there. But because we're lucid now, we'll realize that this appearance is deceiving us. We'll realize that this appearance is a product of our mind. Therefore, if we now, while we're lucid, encounter something pleasant or unpleasant in the dream, it would be very difficult to develop any attachment, aversion, fear, anxiety, and we would enjoy the dream a hell of a lot more. Likewise, this view of emptiness is saying things are like a dream. Meaning now, in the waking world, there appears to be an independent me here, there appears to be an independent world out there. And therefore, and we believe in that, therefore, when we encounter something pleasant or unpleasant, we often have a lot of attachment to the pleasant things, a lot of aversion to unpleasant things. But if we wake up from our sleep of ignorance by realizing emptiness, if we become lucid in the waking state by realizing emptiness, there still will appear to be an independent me here and an independent world there. But because we're lucid now, we'll realize these appearances are deceiving us, that this world of appearance is also a product of our mind. And therefore, if we encounter things that are pleasant or unpleasant, it would become very difficult to develop any attachment or aversion, and we would enjoy our waking life a hell of a lot more. So this is a good analogy that I think is very helpful in trying to understand emptiness dependent arising. Any last question? Otherwise, we'll finish up there for this week. Any last point anyone would like to bring up? Okay, we'll leave it there. So next Thursday, we're going to continue with the Heart Sutra. We're going to talk about the last 3 stages of the path of seeing, path of meditation, path of no more learning. And here we're going to start to then look at moving from this sort of conceptual realization of emptiness based on reasoning and logic to moving into deeper, to a direct realization of emptiness, a non-conceptual realization of emptiness, and how that will enable us to then eventually achieve the goal of enlightenment. So that's for next Thursday night. Until then, sleep well. Sleep well. Enjoy your week. See you next Thursday.
Thank you.